Today, we have a very special bonus video for you guys. It's a collection of 5 true crime stories, and the first story you'll hear is actually a story I told on a live stream. That's the only place I've ever published the story, so if you missed the live stream, you missed the story until today. Because we pulled that story out of the live stream footage, we edited that story, and it's going to be included in today's video. The other 4 stories are fan favorites and some of the most disturbing cases we've ever covered. Now, even if you've seen one of these 4 other stories before, don't worry, they have been completely re-edited, so it will be like a brand new viewing experience. But before we get into those 5 stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So, if that's of interest to you, please offer to fill up the like button's new waterbed, but instead of using water, use quick-drying cement. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. On June 7th, 2008, a middle-aged woman named Kim Spengler was working at this family paint shop. She worked there, she'd been there for several years, and she was stocking shelves, going about her day, when one of her colleagues came up to her and tapped her on the shoulder and said, "Hey, Kim, there's an alarm going off in the parking lot and we think it's your car." And Kim, immediately when she heard this, she became totally panicked. She thanked the colleague and said, okay. And then Kim, she went to the counter where she'd stashed her purse, and she grabbed her keys out of her purse, her car keys, and she put the keys into her fists like brass knuckles. She put the key kind of pointing up out of her hand, and so she's kind of holding her keys like a weapon, and she makes her way towards the door. This is in North Carolina, suburban North Carolina. It was in the middle of the summer, super hot, and she's got these keys in her hand, and she steps outside into the blazing heat, and she can hear the alarm going off, and she looks and she can see it's her car. It's definitely going off. But for Kim, it's like she wasn't really focused on the car. She's sort of anxiously looking around the parking lot, looking for any sudden movement. She's looking if anybody's coming up to her. I mean, she's totally on edge. And the reason for this is because recently Kim had left a very toxic relationship with her boyfriend, a guy named Ricky Simmons, who was 49 years old. Ricky and Kim had connected 5 years earlier when Kim was going through a really dark time in her life. She was struggling with substance abuse. She was just at a low point, and Ricky also was sort of at a low point too in his life. He also was struggling with substance abuse. He had just gotten out of jail. He had served time for manslaughter, in fact. And Kim, I think that she basically looked at him as being sort of like a troubled soul, but somebody that, still had a heart of gold in there somewhere. There was a kinship there. There was a relatability. And so that was 5 years ago from this point in the parking lot with the car alarm. However, a few months earlier, Kim had gotten the strength and become sober. And when she became sober, well, one, Ricky didn't like it. Ricky was sort of not an advocate of hers at all, and so they ended up breaking up, and it was a very rocky breakup. Kim at first thought that Ricky would sort of just get over it, but Ricky began effectively stalking Kim. He began showing up at her apartment unannounced. This is a few months earlier. It got to the point where Kim actually filed a restraining order against Ricky because he was becoming so sort of unhinged. He was so unhappy about what had happened, about the breakup. On top of that, there was something else that really was sitting in the back of Kim's mind, which was, Ricky wasn't just this unhappy boyfriend or ex-boyfriend. He also was the primary suspect in the disappearance of his son's fiance. He had a 22-year-old son, and his son had a fiance. Her name was Jamie Fraley. And around the same time that Kim broke up with Ricky not only became sort of obsessed with Kim and became her stalker, but he also sort of began a lot of the same behaviors with Jamie, again, his son's fiance. And about a month after Kim and Ricky had broken up, Jamie went missing. And Ricky was the primary suspect in her disappearance, and he was actively being investigated for her disappearance. So, from Kim's perspective, she knows that Ricky is, he's an ex-con, he served time for manslaughter, he knows that he's being investigated for this disappearance, And so she's constantly on edge here. Like, despite her restraining order, she does not feel like that's actually going to keep Ricky out of her life. She's very scared of him. And so when her alarm went off, her first thought is, it's got to be Ricky. Maybe he's broken into my car. Maybe he's setting a trap for me, whatever it is. And so as she goes outside, that's what's going through her head. Anyhow, so she gets out in the parking lot. It's blazing hot. She's got her keys in her hand, and she's looking around, but she doesn't see Ricky. Big open parking lot, bunch of cars. She sees her car. And so she clicks her key fob and turns off the alarm, because it is her car that's going off. And she walks through the parking lot, and she gets to her car. You know, she kind of is careful as she's walking up to it, making sure nobody's hiding, you know. But when she gets to her car, she sees there's no damage. You know, the car is undamaged. All the windows are rolled up. There's certainly no sign that anybody broke into her car. And so Kim is thinking, okay, clearly what's happened here is, you know, somebody must have just bumped into it. Like, this has nothing to do with Ricky. This is just, I'm on edge, you know, given what's happening in my life. And so again, she's turned off the car alarm. She checks her car, you know, again, just to make sure, you know, Ricky's not here, and he's not. There's nothing going on with her car. And she ends up going back into the paint shop. And so she goes back in the paint shop, and she finishes up her shift. And by the time her shift ends, which was only a few hours later, you know, she hadn't forgotten about the car alarm thing, because Ricky and sort of the torment he was causing in her life was really front of mind for her. And so when she left the paint shop now to go home, she had calmed down, but like, she's walking through the parking lot, going back to her car, like just again on edge. She's got her keys, you know, poking out of her hand like as a weapon. She gets to her car, and there's nobody there. She immediately hops inside, shuts the door, locks it, turns it on, blasts the AC. And it's like she can relax. Like, okay, she's safe in her car. But as she's sitting there, she sort of took stock of the fact that her car was kind of a mess. Now, normally Kim was a very organized and clean person. You know, she was very tidy. But really, over the past few months that she'd been dealing with this saga, which was the Ricky saga, she had sort of, you know, kind of fallen off on regular duties, like keeping her car clean, that type of thing. But she knew the next day, which was Sunday, she was going to be going to church early in the morning, and she had volunteered to drive some of her church friends to church. And so she's thinking, as she's sitting in the car, you know, exhausted from the day, like, oh, okay, the car is kind of smelly, and there's trash, and there's clothes, and there's this. She's like, I got to clean out my car when I get home, because I don't want to, you know, roll up to my friends tomorrow for church and have this car be smelly and gross. And so she tells herself, as soon as I get home, I'm going to clean my car. And for what it's worth, she typically did do that. Most nights, you know, she would clean her car out, take out the clothes, whatever. But, you know, after her drive, you know, finally ended and she got home, she just, you know, she was checked out. And she's like, you know what? I know I need to take out my dirty clothes and take out the trash and clean up, but I just don't have it in me. So I'll just get up early tomorrow, I'll clean out my car, and then I'll, you know, go about my day. So she gets out of her car, she goes into her apartment, and she goes to bed. The next morning rolls around, and she gets up, except she sleeps through her alarm. She's late. And when she looks at the clock, she realizes she does not have enough time to clean her car. She doesn't really have any time at all. She basically needs to run out of the house, get in her car, and drive and pick up her friends. Otherwise, she's going to be late. I mean, she's already late. She sprints out of her house, gets in her car, and like right away, she's like, oh my goodness, like it's so messy, it smells bad. And she starts driving, and she's like, you know, taking trash and jamming it into the different compartments, doing her best to kind of make it look a little bit more presentable. She rolled the windows down to get some fresh air. But, you know, she ended up picking up her friends for church. And, you know, as soon as they get in, they're very polite. No one's going to call Kim out. They sort of know she's going through a rough time, but it was pretty obvious. They were kind of grossed out by the condition of her car. And, you know, Kim's like very apologetic, like, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry it smells. I'm sorry it's dirty. You know, I should have taken care of this. Next time I will. And they're like, oh, you know, don't worry about it. And so they end up going to church. And after church, Kim went off on her own and sort of spent the day running errands. And around 6 p.m., she ends up coming back to her house. She's done for the day. She pulls into her parking space, and immediately she's like, okay, I need to clean my car. Like, this is a full day overdue here. I got to clean my car. And so she starts cleaning her car. She pulls a trash can over. She takes the trash out of the main cabin of the car. She takes out, you know, work stuff and papers. And then once the interior of the car had been straightened up, she went around to the trunk, because in the trunk was her dirty clothes. And so Kim, she goes to the trunk, she opens it up, flips it open, and she freezes when she sees what's in her trunk. So to understand what she found in the trunk, we have to go back 24 hours. So 24 hours earlier, this is back on Saturday, Kim, you know, her car alarm was going off. So it turns out she was right to suspect that potentially Ricky could have been involved with her car alarm, and I'll explain why. Every Saturday for forever, Kim had a very particular routine. Every Saturday, she would go to the gym in the morning, she would change out of her clothes, and she would put her gym clothes in the trunk, put on her work clothes, she'd go to work, and then in the evening, she would get home and take those dirty clothes out and clean them. That was her routine, and it was such a routine that, like, Ricky was aware of that routine. And so on Saturday, when she's at work, when the car alarm went off, it was Ricky. Ricky had broken into her car. Ricky knew that at the end of the day, she's gonna open up that trunk to take her dirty clothes from the gym and bring them inside and do the laundry. But unfortunately for Ricky, Kim didn't do that, right? So Ricky, he breaks into her car and he climbs into her trunk. And in hand is a knife. He's holding a knife. And he closes the trunk on himself, knowing again, based on her routine, that she's gonna open that up at the end of the night and he can spring out and attack her. But because of Kim's torment from Ricky and how scatterbrained she was, she didn't empty her trunk that night. And so for 24 hours, Ricky stayed in the trunk with that knife, and he eventually cooked to death. And so when she opened it up, he was dead and decomposing in the trunk, still clutching that knife. In addition to that, unfortunately, Jamie Fraley, so Ricky's son's fiance, her body was never found. She was never found. And police still suspect that Ricky had murdered her, but we don't know what happened to her. But what almost certainly happened is simply because Kim did not open the trunk that night, she saved her own life.
Last year, we launched our very first graphic novel, and it went great. I mean, it made the New York Times bestseller list, so thank you all so much for making that happen. But ever since this book came out, we have been hit with so many questions about, hey, when are you going to do another graphic novel? When's book 2 coming out? Well, I have an announcement to make. Check it out. We are doing a second graphic novel, and this is the official cover art. Here it is. This is MrBallen Presents Where Nightmares Live. It's going to have another set of 9 heart-stopping, strange, dark, and mysterious stories, and it comes out September 30th. But you can pre-order it right now if you go to book.ballenstudios.com. Also, there's a link right here and in the description below. There are some signed copies available, but they will go quickly. So please head on over to book.ballenstudios.com to pre-order a copy of our newest graphic novel. I know you're gonna love it. Check it out. Your nightmares are waiting.
In November of 2004, 52-year-old Peter Porco and his wife, 54-year-old Joan Porco, were like so many other middle-aged, middle-class Americans. They lived in Del Mar, New York in a comfortable 2-story home, and they worked for a living. Peter was an appellate court clerk and Joan was a speech pathologist. They had been married for over 30 years and they had 2 sons. Christopher was a 21-year-old student at the University of Rochester, and his brother, Jonathan, was a 23-year-old naval officer stationed at a submarine base in Groton, Connecticut. On Monday, November 15th, 2004, Peter woke up to start his typical Monday morning work routine. He got up, he got out of bed, he went into the bathroom, he relieved himself, he looked in the mirror, he shaved, he got dressed in his work clothes, he went downstairs, he put on a pot of coffee. While the coffee was brewing, he unloaded the dishwasher and then put the dirty dishes into the dishwasher and started it. He wanted to get his newspaper, so he went outside, he got his newspaper, but he realized he locked himself out of the front door. So he got the spare key out from underneath the mat, opened the front door, went inside, he sat down, had some coffee, read the newspaper. After a few minutes, he put his coffee cup in the sink, he packed himself a lunch in his lunchbox, and then he headed for the door to head for work. Peter was known as a very reliable employee who was also very punctual and rarely missed work. So when he didn't get to work that Monday morning, the court was a little bit confused. They called him to see if he was okay. He didn't pick up. So they dispatched a court officer to go make sure he was okay. And so the officer arrives at his house. He sees cars in the driveway, the front door shut. He goes up, he knocks on the door. Nobody answers. He tries the handle of the front door. He realizes it's open. So he opens the door and he yells out, "Hey, I'm just looking for Peter." And the door hits something on the ground. He pokes his head inside and looks down, and there on the ground, the thing blocking the door, is Peter Porco's body. He's clearly deceased, and he clearly has a massive head wound. The court officer steps outside immediately, calls 911, local police show up, they go inside, and sure enough, Peter is dead. They go upstairs and they find his wife, Joan, in bed also with a massive head wound, but she was still alive. Joan was rushed to a hospital where she underwent emergency surgery and then was put into a medically induced coma. Meanwhile, the police began their investigation into who could have done this. They quickly discovered that the home's alarm system had been smashed and a phone line, because there still was landlines at the time, had been cut from the outside, and a screen in one of the windows had been slashed that looked like the way someone climbed into the house. However, nothing appeared to have been stolen because police almost immediately found Peter's wallet with money inside of it still sitting in the house, as well as very expensive jewelry that belonged to Joan still sitting in the house. As they continued to search the house, they discovered a fireman's axe that belonged to the Porcos hidden inside of one of the bedroom closets, and it was very clear this was the murder weapon. The Porco sons had been away during this attack. John was on his submarine in Connecticut, and Chris was at the University of Rochester. And in fact, Chris found out about the attack on his parents when he saw a news report, because this story of this innocent, typical-seeming American couple in a quiet suburb getting struck down by some axe-wielding maniac had gone totally viral, and it was all over the news. And so Chris called the police to get more information about his parents' death. Here's the recording.
Hi, my name is Chris Porco. I was just called by the Times-Union saying that my parents were found dead this afternoon. I was wondering if you had any information for me.
Hey, Chris, whereabouts are you?
I'm at school in Rochester, New York.
Okay, you're in Rochester?
Yes.
Okay, and you're hearing from the Times-Union?
Yeah, they said my parents were found, I guess, I don't know, they didn't say how or anything.
So you will be here probably, you're going to go right to Albany Med?
I don't know, I don't even know where my mom is, but...
Yeah, she is at Albany Med.
Okay, do you know her condition?
No, because I haven't talked to her. Let me give you my pager number.
As you can tell, Chris is extremely emotional. He's beside himself. He can barely speak. He's so upset about what's happened to his parents. No, actually, he sounds as calm as if he's ordering a pizza, because Chris Porco was actually a psychopath, and he was the one who attacked his parents with the axe. As it turns out, Chris was failing at school and taking out huge loans in his father's name by forging his signature, and his father found out about it. So Mr. and Mrs. Porco write their son a strongly worded email where they tell him this behavior has to stop, and they're very disappointed in him, but they love him and they will help him get back on his feet. Chris responded by driving home in the middle of the night, sneaking into his house and attacking his parents with an axe. While this case is already disturbing and horrific and tragic, it's what happens to Chris's father after the attack that makes it one of the most brutal cases of all time. After being struck 16 times in the head and laying unconsciously in his bed as his son snuck out of his house, Peter suddenly sat up and began his morning routine. He got dressed, he went to the bathroom, he shaved, he went downstairs, he made coffee, he did his chores, he went outside to get the newspaper, he got locked out, he got the key from under the mat, went back inside, he packed his own lunch. When he was finally ready to go, he headed for the door and then he collapsed and he died. Due to the severity of Peter's head wound, his brain was basically broken and it was unable to recognize he had been gravely injured. So in his final moments, he believed it was just a typical Monday morning going about his work routine, when in reality, he had a gaping head wound and he was basically dead after the 16th blow to his head. One of the more surprising and heart-wrenching details of this case is that Joan Porco, she did survive the attack. And after she came out of that medically induced coma, she said she forgot all the details of the attack, even though when she was discovered in her bed, she did indicate that Chris, her son, was the attacker. Nonetheless, she got together $250,000 to post Chris's bail, and she allowed him to come stay with her during his trial. And the two attended the trial together, walking into the courthouse hand in hand. Chris was very quickly found guilty of killing his father and attempting to kill his mother, and he was sentenced to 50 years to life in prison. Despite the verdict, Joan Porco still speaks to Christopher over the phone and frequently visits him in prison. It's unclear if she still believes he is innocent. On August 28, 1984, an 18-year-old girl named Elizabeth went missing. On the first day she was gone, her friends and family went out looking for her, but they couldn't find her. The following day, when she still hadn't shown up and no one had heard from her, her parents went to the local police station in their Austrian town of Amstetten, which is about an hour west of Vienna, and they reported her missing. The police launched an initial search of the town and the surrounding areas, but after several weeks, they had found nothing that connected to Elizabeth and where she might have gone. A month after she had been reported missing, her parents came back to the police station, except this time they were carrying a note they say they received in the mail from their missing daughter. It was postmarked from a town that was about 2 hours west of Amstetten, and in this note, Elizabeth writes directly to her parents, and she tells them that she had grown tired of living with them, and she did not want them to come looking for her, and if she discovered they were looking for her, she would just flee the country. After the police read the note, they asked the parents if they thought it was real, if this was a legitimate letter from their daughter, and they said, yeah, they think it is. And then after that, her father, Joseph, suggested that maybe his daughter had run off to join a cult. That was something he thought she was getting into before her disappearance. After the parents left the police station, the police began conducting interviews with other family members and friends of Elizabeth to see if it was possible that she might have run off to join a cult. And virtually everyone they spoke to said, absolutely not. There is no way she ran off to join a cult. That just wasn't her. She was a quiet, reserved person, and they had never heard her talking about a cult or anything that even resembled a cult. These answers left the police feeling very suspicious of the whole situation, and so they decided to look into the young woman's history to see if there was some other reason she might have run off. In their research, they discovered that Elizabeth was one of 7 siblings that all lived together with their parents, Joseph and Rose Marie. Joseph was a successful electrical engineer and real estate developer who was well liked and respected in town, and Rose Marie had gotten married very young at the age of 17, and she had stayed home to take care of the kids. By all accounts, from the outside looking in, they were a very ordinary family, but as the police began to dig deeper and deeper into their history, they discovered there were some big problems behind closed doors. Despite his friendly, outward public appearance, Joseph was actually a ruthless authoritarian when he was home alone with his family. At night, when he came home from work, his wife and his kids would immediately stop whatever they were doing and go silent in hopes they might avoid a beating. The only member of the family that seemed willing to stand up to Joseph was Elizabeth, and she and her father would frequently get into screaming fights, and then as punishment for these fights, Joseph would not only beat his daughter, he would also prevent her from seeing her friends for long periods of time, and he would go through her personal things like her diary. Their toxic relationship finally came to a head when Elizabeth finally ran away from home 2 years prior to her most recent disappearance. She made it all the way to Vienna before authorities caught up to her and brought her back home. Upon learning about this earlier disappearance, the police became convinced that the most recent disappearance was yet another attempt to escape her abusive and controlling father. And so the police decided that this was more of a family affair, and they didn't push the investigation further. A year went by, and neither the police nor her family heard anything from Elizabeth, and so her case was closed. But 24 years later, a seemingly unconnected event broke her case wide open. On April 19, 2008, a 19-year-old named Kirsten was rushed to the hospital in Amstetten. Her skin was so pale it looked almost transparent. She was unconscious and suffering from seizures as well as lung and kidney failure. The doctors were able to stabilize her by putting her into a medically induced coma, but after running a litany of tests, they couldn't figure out what was causing her to have this medical condition, and so they were not able to treat her effectively. They assumed it had to be some sort of genetic condition, so they put her name into the medical database, but nothing came up. Her name wasn't listed. And so this was very perplexing because everybody's name was in this database. And so they took her name and they ran it in other medical databases, and her name didn't show up in any of them. And so totally confused by this girl who seemingly didn't exist, who was exhibiting symptoms of a condition none of the doctors had seen before, the doctors decide they have to speak to the guy she showed up with, an older man who was out in the waiting room. When the doctors approached him, he said he was Kirsten's grandfather, but beyond that, he offered virtually no new information. In fact, he was aggressive and rude and dismissive, and anytime they asked him questions, he would answer as minimally as possible. And when the doctors really fixated on whether or not Kirsten had some underlying medical condition, he would not give them an answer. He would just dismiss it and say he didn't know anything, but it was the doctor's impression that he did know something, he just didn't want to tell them. And this behavior shocked them because they're thinking the information he has could potentially save his granddaughter's life. Why wouldn't he want to give it to us? And so after this disastrous interaction with the grandfather, the doctors decide to get the police involved. There were just too many red flags not to. When the police arrived, they were surprised to find out that this older man in the waiting room was none other than Joseph, the father of the still missing girl, Elizabeth. The police asked Joseph, "What's going on here?" And he tells them that earlier that day, he had opened his front door of his house, and lying on his front step was a girl he had never seen before. It was Kirsten, and there was a note laying on her from his missing daughter, Elizabeth. In the note, Elizabeth writes to Joseph directly and tells him, "This girl here is Kirsten, and she is my daughter, so she's your granddaughter, and she's sick, and I can't take care of her. Can you and Mom take her to the hospital?" While the police had many more questions about this totally bizarre turn of events, they realized that for the time being, they needed to focus their efforts on just getting Elizabeth to contact them, because they needed to know more about Kirsten's medical condition so they could save her life. And so the police went to the media and they put out a message on TV and on radio that was a direct appeal to Elizabeth that basically said, "We need you to come forward as soon as possible and speak to us so we can help save your daughter's life." And all the messages worked, because a week later, Elizabeth, along with her father Joseph, showed up at the hospital where Kirsten was staying. When doctors asked, Joseph did not get into detail about how he actually located Elizabeth. He simply said he found her and now she wants to see her daughter. The doctors noticed that Elizabeth, who was supposed to be in her early 40s, looked like she could easily be in her 60s. Her hair was completely white and her skin was so pale it was almost transparent, just like they had noticed about her daughter's skin. And so after they checked in, Joseph and Elizabeth made their way to Kirsten's room, and the pair went inside, and the doctors that were in there would say that Elizabeth looked terrified. She was hunched over and kind of slouched down, and she wouldn't make eye contact with any of the doctors. And as she was standing there looking at her terribly sick daughter, the doctors began asking her, "Do you know of any underlying health problems your daughter might have that might help us treat her more effectively?" And Elizabeth was so scared she couldn't even talk. And at some point, the questions became too much for her, and she just turned around and walked out into the hall with Joseph. And once they got out into the hall, the police were waiting for them. They had been tipped off as soon as the doctors saw Joseph and Elizabeth come into the hospital. Elizabeth and Joseph were detained and brought to the police station, where they were put in 2 separate rooms to be interviewed. They first interviewed Elizabeth, and initially, just like in the hospital room, she was totally mute and didn't say anything. And for 5 hours, the police grilled her with questions. Where had she been for the last 24 years? What happened to Kirsten? Did she have something to do with her illness? And they kept reminding her throughout these 5 hours that if she never gave them any information, and God forbid something were to happen to Kirsten, she, Elizabeth, could be held criminally liable. And so eventually, Elizabeth, in a very small, meek voice, said, "Okay, I'll tell you the story, but you have to promise me I never have to see my father, Joseph, ever again." When she said this to the police, they could tell she was so scared that they said, "Okay, fine. You never have to see your father again. We'll make sure of it. Now tell us what happened." After that, Elizabeth clutched her hands. She took a deep breath, and then she told them one of the most horrifying stories they had ever heard. A story so disturbing that it would make headlines all around the world for months. It all began 24 years earlier on August 28, 1984, the day Elizabeth went missing. On that day, she told police she was at her family home in Amstetten when her father asked her to come into the basement to help him with something. Her father, for the last several years, had been constructing a bomb shelter in their basement, and he was now only one door installation away from being done. At the time, in the early 1980s, the Cold War was still very much on, and so building bomb shelters inside of your home was a relatively common thing. So Elizabeth goes down into her basement, and she sees her father standing in front of this empty frame where this door is going to go that leads into the shelter. And so she walks over and steps through the frame into the shelter. She turns around and her father hands her this door, and she holds it in the middle of the frame while he secures it to the hinges. And then once it's securely in place, suddenly he swings open the door, knocking Elizabeth backwards farther into the shelter. And before she could stand back up again, her father had run inside and pushed an ether-soaked towel onto her face, knocking her unconscious. When she came to again, she found herself chained up in the very back room of the shelter. It would turn out this bomb shelter that Joseph had spent 6 years constructing was not actually a bomb shelter. It was a prison he was building specifically for Elizabeth. To get into this shelter, you would have to go down the steps into the basement, which looked like a typical unfinished basement. And then on the far wall, you would see these shelves that had things like paint cans and screwdrivers and other tools you would expect to find in a basement. But if you walked over over to the left side of the shelving, there was a lock on the back of it that if you undid it, the shelf itself would swing out like a door, and then behind it on the wall would reveal a 3-foot tall secret door. This secret door was also locked, but not by a key lock. Instead, it was locked by a keypad lock that only Joseph had the code to. And since Joseph was an electrical engineer, he took great care in ensuring this lock never could be tampered with or destroyed. That thing was going to stay locked unless he unlocked it. When Joseph entered his code into the keypad, he could open that secret door and it would reveal this secret underground prison that was basically a winding maze of small rooms with ceilings that were too short to be able to stand up all the way in. If you walked through this secret door and actually entered into this prison, you would start by entering this soundproof narrow hallway that went on for several feet before it entered into this very small bathroom area where the bathroom was unbelievably cramped and there was no doors, there was no privacy. And then if you didn't stop in the bathroom and you just kept walking straight through that first hallway, you would reach another hallway that was totally soundproof and narrow, and at the end of that hallway, it would feed into a very small bedroom that was so small that it barely contained the one bed that was inside of it, and then off to the right side of that bedroom was another door that led into a similarly sized bedroom. All of the walls of this underground prison were made of thick reinforced concrete. That, combined with the soundproofing that Joseph had installed throughout the entire prison, meant no one could hear Elizabeth's cries for help. Also, the inside of the prison was heavily monitored by Joseph's security system, so truly Elizabeth had absolutely no privacy. She was completely trapped, and the only way she was getting out was if her father freed her. For the first 5 years of her imprisonment, she remained in that dungeon all alone. Her only connection to the outside world was her father, who would come down almost every night to drop off basic supplies and to assault her. As far as Joseph's wife and his other kids knew, he was just spending all this time in the basement because that's where he worked when he was not at the office. In 1988, Elizabeth became pregnant with her father's child. She was terrified of the pregnancy and begged Joseph to at least allow her to deliver the child in a hospital. But he refused. He wasn't willing to potentially expose himself for what he was doing. And so he gave her a book about childbirth, and he gave her a pair of scissors to cut the umbilical cord, and he said, "Good luck." And so on August 30th, Elizabeth delivered her daughter, Kirsten, alone in that basement. Following the birth of Kirsten, Elizabeth would deliver 6 more of her father's children, all the same way she delivered Kirsten, alone and in the basement. In 1996, one of Elizabeth's newborn babies, Michael, was born with respiratory issues, and so Elizabeth pleaded with Joseph to take the baby to the hospital to get help, but Joseph refused. He was worried he would be exposed. And so 3 days after his birth, the baby died in Elizabeth's arms. And after the baby died, Joseph just took the body, threw it in a stove, and incinerated it like it was nothing. In the late 90s, the 6 living children down in the basement were getting bigger and noisier, and so Joseph came up with a plan in order to reduce the chances of them being discovered. And so one day, Joseph went downstairs into the basement, and he took one of Elizabeth's youngest children away from her. And then he threatened her and the rest of the kids down there that if they tried to fight back or if they ever tried to escape, he would seal off the basement and he would gas them to death. Previously, Joseph had punished the entire family by turning off their power and cutting off their food and water supply for multiple days at a time, so they knew he was willing and able to hurt them if he wanted to. And so when he took this young child away from Elizabeth, they didn't put up a fight, and the baby disappeared upstairs. And when Joseph's wife, Rosemary, came home, he put on this elaborate charade about how he had discovered this baby on the front step, and that there was a note attached to the baby, and it was from Elizabeth, their missing daughter, and this child was apparently Elizabeth's, and she couldn't take care of it, and she was leaving it here for he and Rosemary to raise it as their own. And Joseph had actually made Elizabeth write out this note and sign it to add credibility to the story. And so when Elizabeth's mother, Rosemary, saw this note and heard Joseph's story, she believed it. Over the next several years, Joseph would steal 2 more of Elizabeth's young children and then stage having found them on his front step with a note from Elizabeth. And with each discovered child, Rosemary amazingly never asked any questions. She just took these kids in, and she and Joseph raised them as their own. Eventually, when these 3 kids got old enough, Joseph would tell them that their real mother, Elizabeth, was a lowlife and she had abandoned them and she didn't care about them, when in reality, their mother and their other 3 siblings they didn't know existed were locked up in the basement below their feet. Initially, investigators believed all of these children Joseph had with Elizabeth were all mistakes, but it would turn out that was not the case. Joseph would admit that the reason he initially imprisoned Elizabeth was because he wanted to completely control her. He wanted to own her. And so he decided that if he could just impregnate her as many times as possible and make her have all these kids, even if she eventually got out of the prison, no man would want her. She had too many kids, and so she would remain his property. And so over the entire time Elizabeth was imprisoned, over 2 decades, the nightly assaults by her father never slowed down. They happened thousands of times. But despite the horrific and tragic circumstances surrounding each of her children's births, she loved her children unconditionally and would spend all of her time doing her best to educate them and care for them. The 3 children that remained with her, that were not taken by Joseph, she taught them how to read and how to write. And when Joseph had given them a TV and a radio to keep down there, she would use those 2 items to try to teach her kids about the outside world, and she would promise them that someday they would get to experience it for real. Finally, in 2008, so 24 years after Elizabeth had originally been captured by her father, her oldest daughter, Kirsten, becomes extremely sick, and Elizabeth convinces Joseph to bring her to the hospital. And 1 week later, Joseph's heinous crimes were revealed to the world. Once police found out about the secret prison, they rushed to the house and they went downstairs and they used the codes and instructions that Joseph had given them, and they went inside and they freed the last 2 remaining children that were still there. When they brought them to the hospital, the youngest of these 2 kids, who was 5 years old, he didn't speak the entire time. He just pressed his face up against the glass of the car window and he stared out in utter amazement, because to that point in his life, he had never actually seen the world. After those 2 kids were brought to the hospital, they were reunited with the other 3 siblings that had been taken away from them years ago to live upstairs with Joseph and Rosemary. And apparently the reunion was very emotional and the kids were extremely happy to see each other. And then a couple days later, Kirsten would come out of her coma and she too would have a chance to be reunited with all of her siblings. Kirsten would ultimately make a full recovery. It would turn out she was suffering from a severe vitamin D deficiency. And vitamin D you primarily get from the sun, and in her 19 years of life, she had never been in the sun. As soon as the story broke about this family being trapped inside of this basement, everybody had the same question. How could Elizabeth's mother, Rosemary, not know what was going on in her basement? But the police had the same suspicions about Rosemary, and they investigated her and they ruled her out. And they said she's not at fault here, she's a victim too. She had been so badly abused by Joseph that she lived in fear of him. And so when he forbade her from ever going anywhere near the basement, she listened. And if she ever heard any strange sounds coming out of the basement, or if she ever suspected any strange behavior by Joseph, she kept those thoughts to herself because she was scared. It's also worth noting that in those 24 years that Elizabeth and her kids were trapped in the basement, Joseph had over 100 people rent out a room inside of his house that was right over the basement. And in those 24 years, not one of those tenants ever said Joseph was acting strangely or complained about strange noises coming from the basement. However, one tenant who was there for a 4-year stretch had a dog with him the whole time, and every night the dog at some point would suddenly stand up, its ears would prick up, and it would start growling like it heard or it saw something. And at first, this tenant would try to see what the dog had seen or heard, but after never seeing anything, he would always just dismiss the dog when it did this at night. Later on, when that tenant figured out what was actually happening inside the house while he was there, he realized his dog was most likely hearing the faint sounds of the family that was imprisoned right below him. After a year of therapy and rehabilitation, Elizabeth and her 6 kids were given new identities by the Austrian government, and they were sent off to a secret location to start their lives over. As such, there's virtually no information about how they're doing today. However, anonymous sources have come forward and said the family has successfully reintegrated into society, and they are all leading relatively normal and happy lives. As for Joseph, he was quickly given a life sentence, and today he is one of the most hated people in his prison due to the nature of his crimes. He is so hated that in 2016, when he was out in general population, he was attacked by other inmates and had several of his teeth knocked out. And so now prison officials are worried if they leave him in general population, he'll be killed, and so he spends virtually all of his time in solitary confinement. He will be eligible for parole in 2024 when he is 89 years old. Robert Pickton was born in 1949 in Port Coquitlam in British Columbia, which is about 15 miles to the east of Vancouver. He, along with his brother and sister, were raised by their parents on a big pig farm. In the 1970s, their parents passed away, and so the property was handed down to them. Robert and his brother took over the daily operations of the farm, and their sister decided to just move away. Over the next couple of decades, Robert and his brother attempted to run the pig farm, but pretty quickly they stopped taking care of it, and it fell into decline. Neighbors and visitors recalled seeing the pigs that were still there free roaming the property. And as for the brothers, it appeared they had just stopped bathing, and despite walking all day in mud and pig feces, it seemed like they never took off their boots when they went inside. One of the few farm workers that stayed with the Picktons through the farm's decline was a guy by the name of Bill Hiscox, and he said the farm was a really creepy place. And he also said Robert was a really creepy guy that was prone to just totally bizarre behavior, even though he didn't smoke or drink or use any substances. Eventually, the Pickton brothers realized they were not cut out to run the pig farm like their family had for generations before them, and they decided their best move was just to sell portions of their land. But neither of them could have guessed just how much their land was worth. From 1994 to 1995, they managed to sell off almost all of their property to an urban developer for over $5 million. And so suddenly, these filthy, failed pig farmers had become millionaires, and neither of them knew what to do with the money. After a year of just sitting on the money and not doing much with it, they decided they wanted to do some good with their money. And so they established an official charity in 1996 called the Piggy Palace Good Times Society. Their charity's purpose, at least on paper, was to help raise money for various organizations that they deemed worthy by running events like dances and shows. And while that might have been their original intention for this charity, what it ultimately became was a guise to host these wild drug and alcohol-fueled parties inside of their slaughterhouse, which, even though it wasn't being used anymore because they were no longer really doing any pig farming, it still conspicuously had big hooks coming down from the ceiling and bloodstains all over the ground underneath them. These Piggy Palace parties became infamous in Coquitlam, drawing crowds of up to 2,000 people, predominantly bikers, drug addicts, and prostitutes from the poverty-stricken downtown east side of Vancouver. Robert had become familiar with that part of Vancouver because he used to go through there all the time to dispose of animal waste products at their rendering plant. Once the Piggy Palace charity was in full swing, Robert started going back into that neighborhood where he would cruise down the 10-block strip called the Low Track and would attempt to recruit people to come to his parties. Most of the people he recruited were down-on-their-luck women who only agreed to go because he was offering them food and money and drugs and alcohol. At the same time Robert was running this recruiting campaign, women from the downtown east side began disappearing in droves. These disappearances were noticed by the men and women in the downtown east side, but they didn't report them because they had a general distrust of the police and of authority figures in general. But as more and more and more women disappeared from the downtown east side, rumors of a serial killer operating in that area started to circulate. Residents began only going outside if they could walk around in a big group of people, and everybody was just totally on edge, keeping careful lookout for anything odd about the neighborhood, people that shouldn't be there, cars that shouldn't be there. But despite this heightened security, women continued to go missing at a rapid rate, and nobody knew why. When the police were finally contacted about all these missing women, their response was lacking, to say the least. Since there were no bodies of these missing women, the police said it was reasonable to assume that the women were to blame, that their lifestyles must have caught up with them and they either ran off somewhere or perhaps they overdosed somewhere and their bodies just haven't been found yet. Despite residents of the downtown east side saying, no, this is different, there's something wrong here, the police basically said, we're not getting involved. When the newspapers found out about this totally apathetic response from the police, they criticized them for intentionally deprioritizing these missing women because the majority of them were drug addicts and prostitutes, and so therefore weren't worthy of a full investigation. The police rejected this claim. On the evening of March 22nd, 1997, so 1 year after the Piggy Palace had been stood up and they started throwing all these parties, and 1 year after dozens of women have gone missing from the downtown east side, the Picktons' neighbor heard a frantic knock on their front door. They ran over, they opened it up, and what they saw was this woman who was hunched over with one hand on her bleeding stomach, and dangling from her wrist was a handcuff. The neighbor was obviously shocked at what they were seeing, but they quickly ushered the woman in and they called her an ambulance. The woman was rushed to the hospital where she immediately was put into emergency surgery. Afterwards, while she was in recovery, she told her nurses that her name was Wendy and she had been at one of those piggy palace parties, and one of the owners of the farm, Robert Pickton, had tried to put a handcuff on her, and when he did, she fought back. He drew a knife, he stabbed her in the stomach, she was able to get the knife back, she stabbed him in the face before turning and running out the door and making it to the neighbor's house. Right after she told this story, Robert Pickton actually showed up at the exact same hospital with a serious laceration on his face that was consistent with being stabbed. The medical staff had already called the police, who showed up minutes later, and when they went inside, they searched Robert and they found in one of his pockets a handcuff key. And that handcuff key opened the handcuff that was still on Wendy's wrist. And so when the police saw that, they arrested Robert on attempted murder. While Robert was in custody, he explained to officers that Wendy was lying. She was a drug addict and she had come to one of their Piggy Palace parties and he had caught her trying to rob them. He had confronted her, she drew a knife, and that's when a struggle ensued and both of them got stabbed. And Robert said he was just lucky to be alive. The police believed him and dropped all of his charges and let him go. When Robert got back to the farm, Bill Hiscox, the one worker who still worked for the Picktons, he grew very suspicious of Robert. He had read all about the missing women from the downtown east side, and he knew Robert regularly went over there to pick up women and brought them back to his parties. And Bill just always had that gut feeling that something was off about Robert. And so he sat on this gut feeling for a couple of months until finally he decided he had to tell someone. And so he called the Crime Stoppers tip line and he told them that he thought Robert had actually attacked Wendy, not the other way around, and that actually Robert was most likely behind some or all of these missing women from the downtown east side. Bill also said that a recent female party guest at the farm had seen a pile of women's clothing inside of Robert's trailer, along with at least 10 purses and women's ID cards. The police followed up with Lisa to confirm what she saw, but she was scared of Robert and said she wasn't going to cooperate. And so the police, without this testimony, were unable to secure a search warrant to investigate this further, and so they kind of just forgot about it and moved on to other cases. Over the next few years, the Picktons continued to throw these huge Piggy Palace parties until the city finally shut them down, and dozens more women disappeared from the downtown east side without a significant police investigation, despite the fact that Bill was calling them all the time to say he believed Robert Pickton was behind all of these disappearances, but they weren't taking him seriously. Finally, in 2002, a former employee of the Pickton farm came forward to police and said that he personally had seen illegal weapons inside of Robert's trailer. And this was enough information for the police to get a search warrant and raid the pig farm. And in February of that year, they did just that. And they found inside of Robert's trailer the illegal guns, as well as several items directly connected to some of the missing women from the downtown east side. Robert was arrested but let out on bail. He was put under surveillance and told he could not go back to the farm until they were done conducting a more thorough search. And during that more thorough search, they found blood from one of the missing women inside of Robert's trailer. And so Robert was rearrested and charged with murder. While he was being held in jail, he shared his cell with another man who he believed was just another detainee. But he wasn't a detainee, he was actually an undercover police officer, and their entire interaction was being recorded. And on this recording, Robert makes a few shocking statements.
What do you got? You know what I'm saying? Yeah. You got, I know what's called. You got a missing person. Regarding how you made it. I find the best way to dispose of something is take it in the ocean. Stay like that. No. That's good. Pretty good. Okay? Pretty much left. That's what I was stopping over. Feel the surges out with the antifreeze, and you inject yourself, and you're dead better than 10 minutes. That was just one more. They can even bigger than the bigger than the ones in the States. Yeah. Oh, yeah. This is already about 40 shoes.
As Robert admits in this video, he killed 49 people, who would turn out to be the majority of the missing women from the downtown east side. After a lengthy investigation, it was determined Robert's killing spree began in 1991, but it really kicked up a notch in 1996 when he and his brother started Piggy Palace, because he was able to use their huge parties to lure more victims to his farm faster. And once they were at his farm, he would lure them into his trailer, where he would handcuff them, tell them it's over now, and he would inject antifreeze into them, or he would strangle them to death. Afterwards, he would move the victim's body to the slaughterhouse, where he would butcher them like a pig. A large portion of his victims' remains would be fed to his pigs, and the parts he didn't feed to his pigs, he would bring to the rendering plant in the downtown east side, which is not far from where the victim was most likely picked up. A rendering plant takes animal waste products, crushes them up, and turns them into a gelatin. This gelatin is used in many everyday products, from candy to cosmetics, which means Robert's victims wound up in things like lipstick and gummy bears. Also, sometimes while Robert was going through this horrific disposal process, he would set aside some of the best cuts of meat and grind them up with pork and turn them into sausage. This sausage was served at Piggy Palace parties. It was also given to neighbors and food banks and orphanages. After sifting through 300,000 cubic meters of soil and pig feces underneath the Pickton farm, investigators were only ever able to find little bits of remains of 26 women. Robert was charged with all 26 murders, but only 6 turned into convictions due to a lack of evidence. His brother and sister were never charged in connection with the crimes. In early 1983, residents of the Cranley Gardens apartment complex in North London began complaining about their drains being clogged up. Initially, their landlord was dismissive and said, "Oh, it's just an old building, it's old plumbing, and that's why it's slow." But eventually, the landlord conceded and asked a plumber to come out and have a look. And so, on the evening of February 8th, an experienced plumber named Mike came out to Cranley Gardens, and after learning what the complaints were, he went around to the side of the building and he opened up a drain cover to have a look inside. As expected, when he shined his light down, he saw wads of hair and napkins and other things kind of mashed together, clogging up the pipes. And so he reached in and he began pulling the stuff out and putting it in a bucket right next to him. And then after he had cleared the majority of the obstruction, he reached his arm all the way into this pipe to feel around to see if there was anything in there that he just couldn't see. And at some point, as he was reaching, when his arm was almost completely into this pipe, his hand hit a major blockage. And so he moved his fingers around to try to feel what it was, but he couldn't tell. It was something that was fairly soft, but there were some hard things inside of it, like sticks or rods. So he grabbed a handful of this blockage and he pulled his arm back out of the pipe. He opened his hand, and what he was holding looked like ground meat, but it wasn't any meat he had ever seen before. And inside of this fleshy substance looked like little bits of bone. Now, Mike had cleared many pipes before, and he had never seen meat be the reason for a blockage. And so this whole situation just seemed really strange, and he decided, it's late, I'll just come back tomorrow with my supervisor so he can see what this is too. So Mike puts the cap back on the drain pipe, and he walks out from behind the building back out towards his truck parked on the road. And as he's walking, 2 of the residents of this complex come out and they say, "Hey, did you fix the blockage? What was it?" And Mike would say no, he hadn't. And then he just kind of blurted out that there was meat in the pipes. That was what was causing the blockage. And then one of these 2 residents says, "Well, I bet people are just flushing their Kentucky Fried Chicken down the drains. That's what's causing it." And Mike looked at him and he was like, "Yeah, maybe." And then he just turned around, got in his truck, and he drove away. Early the next morning, Mike and his supervisor came back to Cranley Gardens, and they went around to the side of the building. They undid that cap, and then Mike reached down inside expecting to feel this blockage, but where it should have been, there was nothing. Somebody had cleared the pipes. And so Mike and his supervisor are looking at each other, and Mike is like, "There's no way that cleared on its own. Someone had to have come out here and cleared it, but I don't know why they would have done that and still had us come out." But the men decide, what, maybe by chance it did just kind of slip through and cleared itself, so let's just continue the process and make sure each of the apartment buildings, their individual pipe is unobstructed. And when they checked these pipes, they found all of them were clear except for one, apartment number 23, whose pipe was blocked up with more of this meaty substance. Mike and his partner were already very suspicious of the fact that someone had snuck out here in the middle of the night and cleared the pipe. Probably. They didn't know if that happened, but it seemed likely. And now they're finding more more of this weird meat substance coming from a particular apartment. And so the whole situation just seemed off. And so they told the landlord that they were not going to touch this. Somebody else had to come out and deal with this. And the landlord, after finding out there was meat jammed in the pipes, got really freaked out and called the police. The police showed up, they pulled this meat substance out of the pipes, and they sent it to a mortuary where a pathologist looked at it and said, "This is meat. It's human meat." And in particular, the stuff that was pulled out of apartment number 23's pipes is that of a human neck. So the police go back to Cranley Gardens, they go up to apartment number 23, they knock on the door, and when the door opens, they're hit with this overwhelming stench of just rotting flesh. And standing in the doorway of this apartment, the owner of the apartment, is this guy who's in his late 30s, early 40s, who introduces himself as Dennis Nilsen. And they say, "Hey, Dennis, can we have a look around your apartment?" And he says, "Why?" And they say, "Well, we found human remains in your pipes." And Dennis immediately says, "Oh my goodness, I can't believe that. That's horrible." But the police are not buying it, and they say, "You know what, Dennis? Tell us where the rest of the body is." And at this, Dennis suddenly went expressionless, emotionless, and he just turns around and he points into his bedroom and he says, "It's in 2 plastic bags in my closet." And so before the police go into his apartment to go inspect these bags, they say, "Dennis, are there any other bodies in your apartment that we should know about?" And Dennis sighs and he looks up to the ceiling and says, "Yeah, there's about 15 or 16 here. It's a long story. It goes way back. I'd love to tell it to you, get this off my chest, and I'll do it at the police station." So after Dennis was arrested and brought to the station, he told them his horrible story. It had all started 5 years earlier in 1978 when Dennis was 33. He was at a pub having some drinks by himself when a teenager came into the bar and attempted to buy an alcoholic drink, and he was denied service. And so Dennis pulled him aside and said, "Hey, I'd be happy to give you a drink at my apartment. It's right down the road." And the young man, whose name was Steven, was very excited about this and said, "Great, let's go." Once they arrived back and they were up in Dennis's apartment, the pair had lots of drinks and they were having fun and laughing, and then at some point the pair climbed into bed together. The next morning, when Dennis got up, his new friend, Steven, was still sleeping right next to him. And he had this sudden, overwhelming sense of dread because he knew as soon as Steven woke up, he would see this as a one-night stand and he would just leave. He would not stick around and remain friends with Dennis. And Dennis just did not like that idea. He wanted Steven to stay. And so he looked on the ground next to the bed and he saw the necktie that Steven had been wearing was on the ground. And so he got on the ground, he grabbed the necktie, he fashioned it into a noose, and then he climbed back on the bed, got on top of Steven's chest, and he looped the tie around his neck, and then he pulled it as tight as he could. And as soon as it was tight, Dennis would tell police that Steven came alive, and he began reaching for his neck and kicking Dennis as hard as he could, but he just can't get it off. And at some point, Dennis said Steven just seemed to give up. He looked up at Dennis and knew he wasn't going to get this off and that Dennis was determined to kill him. And so Steven just allowed himself to go limp and then he slouched over. And as soon as that happened, Dennis said he relaxed. But as he's looking at Steven, he realized he wasn't dead. He was just unconscious. And so Dennis goes into the kitchen and he gets this huge plastic bucket and he fills it up with water and he sets it in the middle of his kitchen floor. And then he gets a bunch of kitchen chairs and he lines them up like a table right in front of this bucket of water. And then he drags Steven's body into the kitchen and he lays him on his back on these chairs, but make sure his head is not resting on the chair. His head is kind of dangling off the back of these chairs. And then he grabbed that bucket of water and he slid it right underneath Steven's head. And then Dennis got on top of the chairs, on top of Steven, and then he pressed the young man's face straight down so his head went backwards until his mouth and his nose were under the water. And Dennis held him like that until Steven regained consciousness, but again, he didn't fight it. He knew he was doomed. And after several minutes, the bubbles stopped coming to the surface and Steven was dead. Dennis pulled his victim off of the chairs, he brought him into the living room and he sat him on a chair. And then Dennis went into the kitchen and he made himself a cup of coffee and he smoked some cigarettes. And then he just stood in the doorway and looked at Steven's body. And he would tell police it was a very bizarre experience because Steven still looked like he was alive. In fact, Dennis would try talking to him as if he was going to talk back, but obviously he didn't. And at some point, Dennis realized, the life he had before he killed Steven was now over. He had a new life and he didn't really know how to handle it. And so the first thing he thought to do was to clean Steven. So he took Steven's body and he brought him into the bathroom and he gave him a very long bath, cleaned his body, cleaned his hair. And then afterwards he got him out, he dressed him and put him into his bed. And then Dennis climbed into bed with him and laid with him. And he would tell police as he laid there, he suddenly felt overjoyed. Stephen was not going to leave him. He was going to stay here as long as Dennis wanted him to. After laying with him for some time, Dennis realized he had to find a way to hide Stephen's body in his apartment so no one could find him. And so he left his apartment and he went to a hardware store where he got an electric knife and a big storage bin. And he brought them back to his apartment, and as he was about to cut Stephen up, he just couldn't go through with it. So instead, he just climbed into bed and took a nap next to Stephen's body. When he got up again, he moved Stephen's body onto the ground in his living room and covered him with a blanket. And then he went and made dinner and then sat in his chair in the living room right next to this body on the ground and watched TV for a while. When he was done watching TV and eating, he looked at the body on the floor and realized, he really hadn't made any progress in terms of hiding him somewhere in his apartment. And that's when he remembered he had a loose floorboard in his apartment. And so he went over to the loose floorboard, he pulled it up, and he saw there was a space under the floors. And so he pulled a couple more boards up, and then he grabbed Stephen's body and he attempted to force him down into this space. But by now, Stephen's body had begun to stiffen up from rigor mortis. Specifically, his arms were outstretched like a Y over his head. And so as Dennis is trying to force him down in there, his arms were not allowing him to go down into that small space. So Dennis took Stephen's body and he propped him up against the wall in his bedroom. So the body is against the wall, rigid, standing up with its arms up over its head, and Stephen's eyes were still open. And then after that, Dennis just got in bed and fell asleep. So all night, this corpse is staring at Dennis in his bed. And then the next morning when Dennis got up, there was Stephen still up against the wall with his hands in the air looking down at him. Dennis grabbed Stephen's body and put it on the ground, and he began yanking and jerking and pulling on each of Stephen's arms until they were pinned down by his side. And then after that, Dennis started working on his legs and his hips, and he began contorting him until he was small enough that he could pack him down under his floor. And then once he was under there, he just put the boards on top and went about his daily life. And for the next couple of days, he totally forgot about Stephen. But a week after putting him under the floor, Dennis decided he missed Stephen and he wanted to see him again. And so one night he opened up the floorboards, he looked down, and there was Stephen, and Dennis would say it looked like he was dirty. So he pulled him out of the floor and he gave him another bath. And then after he had cleaned Stephen, he pulled him out of the water, he dried him off, and he put him in the chair. And then Dennis took a bath himself in the same water he had just used to clean Stephen. After a long soak in this tub, Dennis finally got out, he toweled himself off, he redressed Stephen, and then he forced him back onto the floorboards and covered him up again. And he would remain there for the next 7 months until Dennis finally decided to dispose of him by burning him in a bonfire outside of their apartment building. And then after the body was completely incinerated and gone, Dennis remembered thinking, I can't believe I just got away with murder. And so he would do it again and again and again, killing at least 15 young men from North London, all by strangulation or by drowning or a combination of the two. And after he killed them, he would keep them stashed in his apartment for months at a time, in his closet, in his cabinets, in his bed, under the floors, all over his apartment. He had these bodies. And while these bodies were in his apartment, he liked to periodically take them out to spend time with them. He would tell police he found corpses to be beautiful. He was fascinated by them. But eventually, in 1983, he had so many bodies stashed all over his apartment that he knew he really needed to expedite getting rid of them. And so he began cutting them up and trying to force them down his drain, which eventually clogged the pipes. And so when Mike the plumber showed up and discovered this meaty substance in the pipes, and Dennis overheard him talking about it, that night after Mike was gone, Dennis had gone outside and attempted to clear the rest of the remains from the pipes. But he wasn't aware there were still remains stuck in the pipe that led to his specific apartment. Dennis Nilsen confessed to killing 15 young men and attempting to kill at least 7 others, and he was sentenced to life in prison. Dennis never showed any remorse, nor did he show any desire to want to be free again. He actually said he deserved to be in jail for what he did. In 2018, Dennis Nilsen would die in prison at the age of 72.
In case you haven't heard yet, our newest graphic novel, MrBallen Presents Where Nightmares Live, is available for pre-order right now. It contains another 9 heart-stopping, strange, dark, and mysterious stories, all based on real events. This was a passion project. It took a lot of time, a lot of people involved, from the artwork to the storytelling. I mean, this is a beautiful piece to add to your collection, so you got to check it out. The book comes out on September 30th, but again, you can pre-order your copy at book.ballenstudios.com, or you can click the link in the description below. There are a limited number of hand-signed copies available, but those are going to sell out very quickly. So please pre-order today, because remember, your nightmares are waiting. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. Today, I'm going to share 3 stories that all fall into the category of paranormal. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to cook the like button a really nice big Italian meal. But don't tell them every time it calls for olive oil, you used motor oil. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. One night in the summer of 1921, a young man named Carl Logies walked across the farm that he had recently purchased in rural Ohio. He was on his way to check on his horses and his cattle one last time before he went to bed. He had a gun on his hip and a lantern in the other hand, and as he walked across the farm, he sort of looked out at the farmhouse and the barn up ahead and the water well and all this land, and he couldn't help but feel really proud of what he had. I mean, this was all his. So Carl had always dreamed of having this, of having his own farm. And he'd been able to get this one for a really low price because apparently the people who owned it before him had been very eager to get rid of it. And he had seen it as a great opportunity. Now, Carl didn't really know why they wanted to move it so badly, but he didn't care. It just meant he got a great deal. And so Carl continued walking over to the barn where his cattle and his horses were. And as he got closer, keep in mind it's dark out, it's late at night, he suddenly felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. And he had this unmistakable feeling that he was being watched. But Carl, he lives alone. It's just him and his animals. Like, there's no reason there would be anybody nearby to watch him. And so instinctively, Carl stops where he is and he whips around and he shines his lantern in all directions, just seeing if there's somebody there, but there's nobody. Granted, his field of vision is pretty limited. I mean, it's dark outside, his lantern's not that bright, but for the most part, he can tell that there's no one in the immediate vicinity. He's all alone. So then his thought is, well, is there a predator nearby? I mean, is there an animal watching me? But Carl, he's looking around and it's a peaceful, quiet night. And, the previous owners certainly hadn't mentioned any risk of predators in the area. And so Carl tells himself, he's just being paranoid. He's new to this property. He doesn't really know what it's like to be here. And so he tells himself, you're just overthinking it. Go to the barn, take care of your animals, and just go to bed. Everything is fine. And so Carl turns around and he walks over to the barn. He goes inside and he kind of busies himself getting the horses and the cattle ready for the night. And, he's in there for a few minutes. And for the most part, he's forgotten about that strange feeling he had when he came over, that feeling of being watched. But after he was wrapping up, he couldn't help but start to feel like he had that feeling again, that there was somebody watching him. And so he's looking out his barn door and he doesn't see anything, but it's dark out there and he's kind of looking around the inside of his barn. And again, he's telling himself that you're being paranoid, everything is fine. But admittedly, deep down, Carl was feeling pretty nervous about just this walk he was going to have to make through the darkness across his property back over to the farmhouse. But, he steeled his resolve. He grabbed his lantern and he checked his gun on his hip. And then he walked out the doors of his barn and began quickly making his way towards his house. And as he's walking, he's kind of scanning both sides, checking to make sure nobody's out here, and he's not seeing anyone. And right as he's about halfway to his house, something catches his eye on the far side of the property, something kind of off in the distance. And he stops and he aims his lantern in that direction, which doesn't really illuminate that much, but it illuminates enough to see that there's actually somebody standing on his property. And he's so alarmed by it, he just stands there holding his lantern, looking at this person, and it's like this white silhouette just standing there still, looking right over at Carl. They're sort of in the vicinity of his water well. And after being frozen for a second, Carl kind of snapped out of it and he said, hey, who are you? What are you doing here? And this figure doesn't move, doesn't react. They just stand there kind of staring at Carl, and then they turn and begin kind of moving away from Carl in the direction of the water well. And Carl, at this point, he doesn't know what's happening. He thinks that this person clearly is some sort of trespasser. They must have been here earlier. Like, that's what I was feeling. They were here. They've been watching me. Are they gonna try to rob me? Like, who is this? And so he draws his gun and he starts chasing after this person. And as he's running, his lantern's waving back and forth. And like, as he's running, he loses sight of this white figure. And by the time he actually gets to the water well, he realizes he's lost this person. They're just gone. At this point, Carl really didn't know what to make of this. He didn't know where this person went. Like, he has no idea if they've doubled back around and they're gonna try to go in his house at some point here. He does not understand what's happened or where they've gone. He doesn't know who they are. And so all he can think to do as he's standing there by the well, out of breath, from running there, is just to yell out that, he's got a gun and he's not afraid to use it and don't you dare come back here. But despite yelling out these sort of open-ended threats into the darkness, there's no response. And he doesn't see this white figure anywhere. It's just dark and silent in all directions. And so for a while, Carl just stood there at the well, just, looking out, almost expecting to see this figure reappear, but they never did. And eventually, when it really felt like everything had kind of calmed down on his property, he just turned and run the rest of the way over to his farmhouse. He went inside and locked the door behind him. Now, the next morning when Carl woke up, he tried to tell himself that whatever happened the night before, it had to be an anomaly. Like, maybe that was a neighbor who had come over and they were shy, or maybe it was, a potential trespasser or a thief or something, and they were scared off by Carl's threats of being willing to use his weapon. Like, Carl is telling himself that whatever that was last night, he likely would never encounter that person ever again, and it was handled. But Carl was wrong. Almost every single night from that night onward for the next year, at about 9:30 p.m. every night, around the time that Carl would go to the barn to check on his animals before bed, he would always see that figure. And they were never close enough that Carl could actually see who it was or get any sense of what they wanted. They were always just kind of off on the side of the property, always watching Carl every time he came out of the barn. And then when he would invariably scream at them and run towards them, and even at one point he fired his weapon in their direction, every time this figure would just, without saying anything, move away from Carl in the direction of the water well, and around there, Carl would lose sight of them. They would just vanish. Now, as much as Carl really wanted to pretend that this was just something explainable, that this was some person coming on his property that was evading his capture every single night, as much as he wished that could be the explanation, Carl knew, despite not being a very superstitious or, a believer in the paranormal, despite not being those things, he felt like what he was witnessing was a ghost. I mean, what else could it be? It's this white figure that floats away from him and vanishes every night. Like, that's a ghost. And also, another part of Carl was thinking, like, the previous owners were really excited to sell this property effectively at a loss. It's like they just wanted to be rid of this property. And he couldn't help but feel like, maybe there's a connection between what I'm seeing and why they left. But the one thing that Carl hung on to was that despite how unsettling this whole thing was and how terrifying it was to, see this figure floating around on his property, despite that, the reality is it was pretty predictable. Every night around 9:30, he would see this ghost, whatever it was, but it didn't really affect him or his animals. It was just terrifying. And he accepted that. It just sort of became his new normal. That is, until August 1st of 1922, which happened to be almost exactly a year after Carl had purchased this property. On that day, Carl noticed his horses, his cattle, they stopped drinking the water, the well water that he gave them all year long since he had been here. They had never had any issues with it, but on that day, they just stopped drinking it. And in fact, they were kind of skittish around the water, like there was something in the water that was upsetting them. Carl tasted the water, it tasted fine to him, but he assumed there just must be something in it that made it unclean to the animals. And so what he had to do was clean the water, which meant he needed to drain the well, get rid of all this dirty water, and let the well refill, and hopefully at that point it will be clean. So Carl goes over to the water well. Remember, this is always where the figure goes off and disappears to. And as the water began to drain, he realized there was something in the well, clearly deep in the well that he never would have been able to see unless he drained it. And here he is draining it, and he's looking down and he can't quite tell what it is, but eventually the water was shallow enough that it was obvious what was in the bottom of his well. And at that point, he went and got the sheriff. It would turn out 5 years earlier, Carl's farm had been owned by another man whose name was Frank Lerman. And Frank, when he was here, had multiple employees, including a young farmhand named Henry Leipenstick. And one day, Henry had gone missing. Henry didn't have any family or close friends who lived nearby, and so basically everybody in town assumed that Henry must have just left town. But one of Frank's neighbors had told the sheriff at the time that she didn't actually believe that. She thought maybe Frank himself had done something to Henry. Because according to her, Frank and Henry argued all the time about money. Like there was clearly real tension between those two. The sheriff tried to look into Frank to see if there was any legitimacy to this claim. But at the same time this investigation was beginning, Frank abruptly sold his property and moved away. And without any real evidence, the sheriff couldn't prove there was any foul play involved. And so he just had to close the case and move on. Until Carl, 5 years later, drained that well. And suddenly, the Henry Leipenstick case was solved. Because at the bottom of the well, Carl found Henry's very decomposed body. He was practically skeletal by this point, but they could tell that was Henry. An autopsy later revealed that Henry had died of blunt force trauma to the head, and his death was ruled a homicide. Frank was arrested and found guilty of second-degree murder, but he only served 7 months before his charges were dropped due to insufficient evidence, and he was released. When they pulled Henry's remains out of the well to give him a proper burial, they noticed he was wearing a watch, and the watch had stopped at 9:35 p.m., precisely the time that Carl, for a whole year, saw that white figure running off, disappearing over towards the water well where Henry's body was located. After Henry's body was properly buried, Carl never saw that white figure ever again. Also, it's believed that the previous owners right before Carl, who sold him the property at a discount, likely they were selling it because they too had seen Henry's ghost. Happy New Year, everybody. And to celebrate this new year, I actually have a pretty huge announcement. So beginning this Monday and going forward, we're going old school on this channel. We're going back to 2, 3, even 4 uploads a week. And this is none of that oh, we edited it differently, so it's brand new. No, we're talking new content up to 4 times a week. So how will it actually work? Well, this week, you're gonna be getting new stories on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and of course, Saturday. Saturday is the same as it's always been and will continue to be. And then each and every week after that, you're gonna be getting 2, 3, even 4 brand new MrBallen episodes every single week. You've told me that you want more strange, dark, and mysterious stories, and now you're gonna get it. Can't wait to see you guys. Thank you. Late one night in the winter of 1933, a young nobleman named Anton Holberg poured another round of drinks for all of his buddies who were sitting inside of one of Anton's many sitting rooms inside of his huge castle that he owned in southern Poland. And after pouring these drinks, Anton kind of clumsily began walking his way over to the table where his buddies were. And because Anton was pretty drunk, because he and his friends had been drinking for hours and playing cards and partying, Anton stumbled at some point and basically spilled half of the drinks onto the carpet. But because he was so drunk, he just thought it was really funny. And so did his friends. They were all roaring with laughter as he's on the carpet, picking up all these basically empty glasses. But then instead of going back and re-pouring the drinks, Anton, sort of as a joke, walked over to the table, sat down, and handed out these basically empty cups to his friends. And everybody thought it was so funny. And they didn't even get up to get more drinks. They were just all so drunk and happy, they just kept on playing their card game. And so as Anton's sitting there and everyone's laughing and smiling, the friend of his that was the dealer for this round of blackjack began to deal. But as he did, there was this sudden, really loud creaking sound that came from right above them. And it was so loud and so pronounced that even amongst this loud room of drunk men playing cards, everybody heard it. And there was a moment of silence where everyone sort of registered like, what's going on above us? And in this sudden stillness, Anton, he sort of made a jest and he goes, oh boy, that's the monk. Now, for the most part, everybody at the table, all of Anton's friends that were there, they had heard the story of the so-called hooded monk that apparently haunted the castle. That's at least what Anton would say. But one person who was there that night was a new friend of Anton's, and they had not heard of, the monk's story. And they said, well, what are you talking about? That's the monk. And immediately everyone's like, oh, geez, here we go. Because Anton, he looked over at the friends and he was like, oh, you haven't heard the story of the hooded monk? Let me tell you. And then Anton basically told this friend, as the rest of the friends are all like, give me a break, this is just crap, this is not real. But Anton would tell this person, this newbie, that when he took ownership of this huge castle, he was told that everything's fine, except there's one bedroom upstairs that's totally off limits, because apparently it is haunted by a hooded monk, an evil hooded monk that sort of patrols this room. And Anton told this friend that he actually had never gone in that bedroom because he believed the story was true, that maybe, just maybe, there really was a malevolent spirit, a hooded monk figure that was in there. And also, he had tons of bedrooms in his castle. He didn't need to go in there, but, right above us is that off-limits bedroom, and so maybe that creak we heard was the monk. Now, again, basically everybody in the room knew this story because Anton loved to tell the story of how his castle was haunted. But that's all it ever was. It was just some story that Anton told. But this friend, when they heard this from Anton, their reaction was, wait a minute, you have a bedroom in this castle that you own that you literally haven't gone inside of because there's a ghost in there? Are you kidding me? You literally haven't gone in that room for that reason? And as they said it out loud, all of Anton's other friends sort of picked up on how cowardly it seemed for Anton to have never gone in. Suddenly this story just made it seem like Anton was just kind of a coward. And everybody just piled on. They're like, yeah, Anton, why haven't you gone in there? Come on, man, this is your castle. Go in that bedroom. And before long, Anton was no longer happy to be talking about this story. He was like, oh yeah, just forget about it, guys. Let's get back to our game. But nobody would let it go until finally they dared him hey, not only should you go in there, but tonight, you should stay the night in that bedroom to show us that you're really not afraid. And eventually, because Anton was so drunk and he was sort of standing up for his pride, he finally said, fine, fine. I'll go in there and I'll spend the night. Fine, I'll show you that this is just a story, it's no big deal. Now, after Anton loosely agreed to this, he likely thought that, the guys will forget about this and we'll go back to playing cards, and by the end of the night, nobody's gonna make sure I really go into that bedroom tonight. They're gonna forget about this. But no, the friends would not let this go. And at the end of the night, when they had kind of wound down their card game and everybody was feeling pretty tired, they all were like, okay, Anton, we're gonna walk you up to your bedroom to make sure you sleep inside of that haunted room. And because Anton had already publicly declared that he wasn't afraid and he would do it, he was like, okay, let's go. And so the group, with Anton in the lead, they left the sitting room and they went up the stairs to the second floor, and they go down the hallway to the bedroom where supposedly, this hooded monk ghost resided. And the door, it wasn't barred up or anything, but again, Anton had never been in there, but he had grabbed the key. And Anton, he goes up and he sort of nervously unlocks the door, and then before pushing it open, he turns and looks at his friends and he's like, all right, I'm going in, trying to see if they really wanted him to do it. And all his friends are sort of looking at him sort of hesitantly, but they're like, yeah, go inside, go, do it. And Anton's like, all right. He pushes the door open, and he and his friends, they all look inside. For the first time, Anton is now laying eyes on the inside of this bedroom. And really, there was not much to see. I mean, it was a bedroom, and there was old furniture in there that looked like it had been there for hundreds of years, covered in dust, and there's cobwebs everywhere, but it basically just looked like a really old bedroom that nobody used. And so his friends are like, all right, Anton, get in there. And Anton's like, all right, I'll see you in the morning. And he goes inside the room and he shuts the door. And then the friends, they all walked back down the hall, went into their respective bedrooms where they were sleeping, and everybody went to bed. Several hours later, in the middle of the night, as all the friends are all asleep, there's this sudden, extremely loud, blood-curdling scream that appeared to be coming from the bedroom where Anton was, inside the haunted room. And so the friends, they jump out of bed, they run into the hallway, they go down the hall, and they get to the door and they try to open it, the room that Anton's in, but it's locked. And they start banging on the door, yelling, Anton, are you okay? Are you okay? Because even though they had put him up to this, they had dared him to do this, they didn't really think there was any risk, but at the same time, maybe, maybe there was something bad in there. So they're worried. They're worried about Anton. They want to make sure he's okay. But after pounding and yelling on the door, there was no response. The haunted bedroom where Anton was completely silent. And the friends, they all kind of exchanged worried glances, and they're like, we got to get in there. We got to make sure he's okay. Something just feels wrong. That scream, that's somebody in danger. Like Anton could be hurt here. And so they began smashing this door, ramming into it, until finally they literally blew the door off its hinges. And when they looked into the room and saw what was going on, they couldn't believe it. When Anton went into the bedroom to spend the night, his friends would recall hearing the sound of him turning the key and locking the bedroom door behind him. So Anton is in this haunted bedroom and he's locked inside, and there's no other way in or out of this bedroom. So he is in there totally alone and he's locked the door. So keep that in mind. So now, a few hours later, after hearing the scream, the friends blow the door open, literally knock it off its hinges because it was locked, and they find Anton, and he's dead. And he's laying on the bed on his back, and the only sign of something that happened to him is there's this red mark around his neck, like a ligature mark, a thin red ligature mark around his neck. But there's no rope or line anywhere in the room. There's no sign of a struggle. There's nothing else really in this room except for Anton. And he's just inexplicably dead with this mark on his neck. Authorities got involved and they searched the room top to bottom, and they never found any rope or any line, nothing that could have left those marks on his neck. And they also did an autopsy on Anton, but they couldn't figure out what his cause of death was. So just the fact that Anton died in this really inexplicable way in a bedroom that he claimed was haunted is pretty mysterious. But it becomes even more mysterious when you consider the whole story about this ghost that haunted this castle. So Anton, when he would typically tell the story, would just basically say, well, there's this evil hooded monk that is upstairs in one of the bedrooms, and that's why I don't go in it. And that's kind of the whole story. But that's not the whole story. That's just kind of the version that Anton would tell. The whole story was, this castle has been haunted for hundreds of years. There is an evil monk that lives in that bedroom upstairs, and if you go in there, the evil monk will kill you by strangling you with a thin rope. That's the story. And so it really makes you wonder, because to this day, nobody knows how Anton Holberg died alone in that locked bedroom after seemingly being strangled by a rope that didn't exist. Around 1 a.m. on Sunday, January 20th, 1907, a 57-year-old man named Samuel Hughes was riding on a passenger train that was moving through southeastern Wales. Sam had spent basically the last 24 hours working the entire time. He was a salt merchant, and he had left the town where he lived, a town called Blackwood, and taken a train south about an hour to another town called Newport, where he did a lot of business. And basically all day Saturday, from early morning all the way until late at night, he had been working. And now finally, 1 a.m. on Sunday, he's back on a train heading back to his town in Blackwood. But despite how utterly exhausted he was on this ride back home, barely able to keep his eyes open, Sam was just so relieved that soon, very soon, he would get off the train, he'd be back in his house, and he could just collapse in bed. And so that's all he's thinking about. And so for a little bit longer, Sam is, fighting to keep his eyes open, and the train's rumbling along, and he can tell he's getting close to home. I mean, he rides this train all the time. This is a pretty, regular route for him. And then finally, Sam feels the train start to slow down, at which point he gathers up all his things. He gets up and kind of shuffles his way into the hall. And then once the train came to a full stop, he stepped off the train onto the platform, relieved that, he's now maybe 10 minutes from home. But as the train took off from the station, Sam, who's again standing on this platform, it's late at night here, he's looking around and he realizes something. In his stupor, in his exhaustion, he didn't realize this was not his stop. He had gotten off one stop too early. It was like he was on autopilot. He was so tired, he got off thinking he was home, but he wasn't. And now the train is gone. And remember, this is the early 1900s. He didn't have a quick way to get from where he was to his home. Like, there wasn't going to be another train anytime soon, nor did he know the train schedule. He also didn't have a way to call a cab or anything. It's 1, 2 in the morning here. And so Sam realizes he basically can either find a place to stay in whatever town this is, or he can basically walk to Blackwood, which is, a pretty good walk away, but he figured, maybe, this town was close enough he could do it. And so he figured, his first step here is just leave the platform and just go find somebody, anybody in town that maybe is out and about, and just kind of figure out where we are, how do I get to Blackwood, is there a hotel nearby or an inn or something, but he needs to go find somebody. And so even though Sam at this point is furious with himself and really just wants to spend time dwelling on the fact that he's made this mistake, he's sort of over that, and he's just focused on finding a solution. And so Sam leaves the platform and he starts walking, in the general direction of lights that he sees off in the distance. But this is a small train platform. He's clearly not near any major city. It's pretty much dark and just rural roads going in different directions. And so he really does not have high hopes that he's gonna run into anybody anytime soon. But surprisingly, after leaving the platform and walking not very far, he got to an intersection where he saw another person walking up the other street. And he quickly realized it was a police officer. And so Sam is like so relieved, an authority figure, they can help me. And he flags down the police officer, and the officer comes over and, they're kind of sizing up Sam, like, what are you doing out here? It's the middle of the night. You got luggage with you. Like, what's going on here? And Sam explained the mistake he had made and asked the officer, like, hey, is there a place to stay here? Or maybe, is it walkable to get to my town, Blackwood? And the officer would tell him, like, there is places to stay in this town, but if you're up for it, it would only take you, maybe an hour if you did want to make the walk to Blackwood. And, if I was in your shoes, I might do that. And Sam, he thought about it and he was like, you know what? I just want to get home. I want to get in my own bed. So yes, just point me in the right direction. And so the officer, he explained to Sam that luckily it's really simple. You just basically go straight down that road and you walk for about an hour until you reach a bridge. Once you get over the bridge, follow some signs and it'll be really obvious that you're right near Blackwood and you'll make it the rest of the way. And so Sam thanked the officer and then gathered up his things and he began walking in the direction of his town. Several hours later, a little after 3 a.m., Sam's wife, Bess, was awake inside of their home in Blackwood. She was awake because she was waiting for Sam to get home. She knew he would have a long day in Newport, but by now she knew he should be home. I mean, he went on this trip fairly regularly. She knew how long it took, even on the long end. And it being 3 a.m. and him not being home was starting to be pretty concerning. And so she's up, she's kind of anxious, and all of a sudden, she hears Sam calling out to her. He's clearly out in front of the property. He must have known that she was awake. He could see the lights on inside the house, and he was calling out to her that, he was returning. And so Bess, she's overcome with relief. She knows her husband is safe. She grabs a candle and she goes to the front door to greet her husband. She opens the door and she looks out, and it's not her husband. Her husband is nowhere to be found. Instead, there is this dark figure standing on her porch, just inches away, looking right at Bess. And Bess, she freezes when she sees it, but she isn't scared. There's a weird calm about what she's looking at. She doesn't know what it is. She has no idea what to do, but she's just standing there calm as this figure is right in front of her, not moving. And as she's just staring at it, she realizes it's dressed in this long black cloak, and it had on a black silk hat. And her husband always wore a black silk hat. And she knew specifically he had worn it that morning when he went to Newport. And so for a minute, she's just staring sort of unbelievably at this apparition, apparently wearing clothes, at least a hat, that belonged to her husband. And she knows she just heard her husband call to her. She didn't imagine that. He just called to her. But then Bess blinked and the figure just vanished. The hat, the cloak, it's all just gone. And there's nobody standing on her porch. And now Bess is scared. Because as much as there was a calm about this figure, now she's thinking, like, did I just imagine that? Like, what's going on here? Is my husband outside somewhere? Did he call to me because he's hurt or something? And so she leaves her house with this candle and she's running around her house calling out for Sam, but Sam's not out there. And so eventually Bess goes back inside the house and just continues to sit up waiting for Sam. But Sam doesn't come home. And eventually, by 5 or 6 in the morning, Bess just goes to bed. When Bess woke up later that afternoon, Sam still had not come home yet. But now, the sun is out and she's telling herself that weird thing that happened last night, she must have imagined that, like that didn't happen. And Sam's fine. He'll be home. He's stayed late before and not told me. Like, everything's okay. But as Bess is reassuring herself that everything's okay, she hears a knock on the front door. And for a second, she thinks maybe it's Sam. Maybe he's home. But she goes to the door, she opens it up, and it's a police officer. And he just says to her, "I have some terrible news." It would turn out the night before, when Sam met that police officer who told him to walk this way to get back to Blackwood, well, Sam had followed the directions, and apparently he was on the right path because he got all the way to that bridge that the officer said would, demarcate that he was close to Blackwood. But perhaps because he was so exhausted, or maybe just because it was still so dark outside, he fell off the bridge to his death. And so the police officer is telling Bess this, and she's totally overcome with grief. But then for whatever reason, her mind immediately went to that dark figure she saw on the porch a little after 3 a.m. And without really thinking this through, she just said to the officer, "What time do you think he died?" And the officer was like, "Well, based on the officer that directed Samuel in that direction, towards the bridge, and how long it would have taken him to get there, we estimate he likely fell off the bridge around 3 in the morning." And so for Bess, she's thinking, that's around the same time I saw that figure on my porch. And then she also began to think about that hat, the black silk hat that Sam always wore, that she knew he had worn that morning when he went to Newport. And so Bess's next question was, well, when you found him, was he wearing his black silk hat? And the officer was kind of confused and said, no, he wasn't wearing a hat at all. And so when Bess heard that, those details confirmed that who or what she saw on her porch earlier that morning, the dark figure with the black silk hat, that must have been Sam's soul. He was coming to say goodbye to his wife because he had just fallen off the bridge and died. And, this figure having that black silk hat on was a way of showing her that, yes, that really was her husband. Bess would later tell this story to a reporter who would have this story printed all over Wales, and that's how we know it today. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.
Today, I'm going to share 3 stories where last-minute decisions changed the course of history. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right channel because that's all we do, and we upload 3 or 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please replace all of the like button socks with the kind that always slips down inside of your shoe. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. On the evening of October 4th, 1912, a United States political candidate was in his hotel room in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. In less than an hour, he was scheduled to deliver a very important speech to local voters he hoped to sway in his favor. Even though he was nervous, he was really excited about giving this particular speech because he and his speechwriters had spent weeks putting together this 50-page script that he was now holding in his hands. And so he paced around the room, flipping through the first couple of pages of the script, reciting lines before checking his watch and seeing that it was time to go. And so he took a deep breath, he took his thick 50-page document, folded it in half, and then tucked it inside his right inner jacket pocket. And when he was ready, he walked out his hotel door, down the front steps, and out the front door of the hotel where a huge crowd was waiting for him. People were singing his praises and yelling to him and trying to get him to react to them as he walked out of the hotel towards his car. And as he was walking, his own personal security detail had formed up around him and were doing their best to keep the crowd at bay. And when the candidate finally got to his open-air car, he stepped inside and then stood up, took his hat off, and continued to wave to the crowd. And then right before his car was about to take off, there was a loud bang from somewhere out in the audience, and the candidate hunched over. He had been shot. His security detail immediately recognized who the gunman was, and they attacked him, kicking his gun away and putting him in a chokehold. And the rest of the crowd kind of forms up and begins beating on this gunman. And amidst all this chaos, the candidate who's just been shot stands up and yells to the crowd, "Don't kill him! Don't kill him!" "Bring the gunman to me." And the crowd is so surprised that their candidate is not on the ground because, again, he's just been shot, that they stop. They stop attacking the gunman. And even the security detail, they're just holding the guy in a chokehold, looking up at the candidate like, "Really? You're not down? You just got shot." And so the candidate looks at the gunman and he says, "Why'd you do it?" And the gunman stays silent. And so the candidate says, "Okay, just take this guy away." And so the security detail hand this guy off to the cops. And so now the crowd's all looking at the candidate, wondering how in the world he's acting like everything is totally okay, because again, he just got shot. And so this is when the candidate reaches into his jacket and he pulls out that thick script he had tucked inside of his right pocket, and he holds it up to the crowd, and there's clearly a bullet hole that went through the script. The script had stopped the bullet and saved the candidate's life. All of his aides were urging him to go to the hospital immediately, but the candidate refused and said, "Bring me to that speech." And just a couple of minutes later, the famous American president, Theodore Roosevelt, delivered his 50-page speech, although he did have to make some changes to it on the fly because there were holes on every page. On an icy cold December night in 1776, a farmer living in New Jersey looked out his window and thought he saw something move at the end of his road. He put his hands to the glass and tried to get a better look, but he couldn't see it. It was too dark, there was no illumination. But he didn't need to see it to know what it was. He could hear it coming. Panicked, he stumbled backwards, turned around, ran into his bedroom where he told his wife to stay in the house, keep the kids here, do not leave for any reason. And then this farmer bolted out his back door, hopped on his horse, and began blazing towards town. He didn't know how much time he had, but he knew he had to warn the German man, Johann Rall. After riding for a couple of minutes, he arrived at the town of Trenton. He turned down a couple side roads, and then he arrived at this beautiful two-story home where Johann was staying. And so the farmer got off his horse and walked towards the front door, and right before he got there, a German soldier came outside, shut the door behind him, and told the farmer to stop. And the farmer told the soldier in English that he had to speak to Johann. He had a warning for him, but the German soldier didn't speak any English, and so there was this total miscommunication, and at some point the German soldier indicated to the farmer that it was impossible for him to come inside, that Johann was actually playing cards and did not want to be disturbed, and so the farmer needed to leave. But the farmer was desperate and he pleaded with the soldier to let him speak to Johann. It was an emergency. He had a warning for him. But the soldier either again didn't understand or he just didn't care. And he tried to tell the farmer to leave once again. But the farmer really wasn't taking no for an answer, and so he pulled out a piece of paper and he scratched this ominous warning on it and he gave it to the soldier and he said, "Give this to Johann." And so the soldier reluctantly takes the note, he looks at it, it's in English, he can't read it, and so he just nods to the farmer and says, "Okay, I'll give it to Johann." Once the farmer had got back on his horse and left, the soldier turned around, went through the front door, and walked back to the dining room of the house where he found Johann around a table with a bunch of other guys laughing and drinking and playing cards. And this soldier very reluctantly walks up to Johann, hands him the note, and apologizes for the interruption. And Johann looks up at him, he's obviously annoyed, and he scolds him for interrupting him. He takes the note and he looks at it and he can see that it's in English. And like the soldier who's brought it to him, Johann could not read English. And so he's looking around the table, he's got this great poker game going, he's having so much fun. He didn't want to step away and have to get a translator and read this note, which to him was probably meaningless anyways. And so he tells the soldier that, you know what, he'll read it later. And he takes the note and he puts it in his pocket and he goes back to playing poker. Johann would never read that note, and in a couple of hours, Johann would be dead. Johann Rall was a colonel fighting for Great Britain during the American Revolution, and he and his Hessian brigade that had taken up residence in this home inside of Trenton, New Jersey, believed the American rebels were on the verge of defeat. And certainly they were not about to launch an attack now, not on a freezing cold December night. But they were wrong. That farmer was a British loyalist, and what he saw when he looked out the window at the end of his road was the famous American military general George Washington and his ragtag army after they had just completed their famous secret crossing of the Delaware River. That note Johann was handed was a warning that they were on the way. Had he bothered to read it, he and his well-trained Hessians could have very easily crushed Washington and his men, and that would have been the end of the American Revolution, and America would still be a British colony today. Instead, Johann and his men were caught off guard and wiped out, and the Americans would go on to win the war and their independence from Great Britain. In 1912, 37-year-old David Blair was a senior merchant seaman working for the British shipping company called White Star Line. In February of that year, he was informed by his company that he would be the second officer of this massive luxury cruise liner that was still being built in Northern Ireland. As the second officer, David's primary responsibility was the ship's navigational operations, amongst other things. Now, David had handled these responsibilities on other ships, but he'd never done it on a ship of this size. This would easily be the most challenging thing David had done in his career to date. But he told his family he was really excited about it. David immediately moved to Belfast, where the ship was being built, and he lived there for 3 months until construction was done. On April 2nd, the final rivet was put into the ship, and it was launched successfully into the water. And then after that, David and the rest of the crew and staff got on board and they set sail. Their first stop was Southampton in the UK, and for this leg of the journey, it was just going to be the crew and the staff. 2 days later, they arrived without incident, and for the next several days, the ship remained in port as the crew prepped it for its first true maiden voyage, which was going to be to New York City. On April 10th, all preparations had been made, and finally, it was time to allow the paying customers to come on board. And in just a couple of hours, thousands of people were on board this huge ship. And just hours before they were set to depart, David was given some bad news. His bosses at White Star Line had decided that this journey was too high profile, and while David certainly had experience, he didn't have a lot of experience with huge ships. And so he was being replaced with someone who did. Understandably, he was crushed, but more than this being a disappointment, this 11th hour change was a huge hassle. With literally thousands of passengers getting in the way all over the ship, David needed to scramble and run all over the place and collect all of his things in the cabin, up on the bridge, in various closets he had put things. He had to do that as fast as he could before the ship took off. And so finally, after doing that with his last armful of luggage in hand, he said goodbye to the crew and to the staff. He said best of luck to his replacement, and he walked off the ship for good. David, with all of his luggage, made his way to a hotel where immediately that night he wrote a letter to his family saying how disappointed he was, and then after that he went to bed. The next morning, when he was going through all of his luggage, he discovered that he had taken a key by accident from the ship. And this key was to a special closet that he was in charge of as the second officer that contained all of the ship's binoculars. And so he felt terrible, but there was nothing he could do. The ship had already left and was on its way to New York. And so the best he could do was he would mail the key back to them in New York when they got there. Back on board the ship, when they discovered this key was missing, they did figure out that David must have it because he was the only one who would have had the key, and it's a brand new ship, so nobody else would have had it. But they decided that it wasn't worth turning around to go get this key. They figured their lookouts were skilled enough they could spot any obstructions with their naked eye. Well, 5 days later, that ship, the Titanic, struck an iceberg and sunk, killing 1,500 people. One of the very few survivors was a guy named Fred Fleet. He was one of the lookouts who actually saw the iceberg first, and he would testify at a Senate inquiry that if he had had binoculars, he would have been able to see the iceberg far enough in advance that they could have avoided it. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it, so give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we will pin you at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please replace the like button socks with the kind that always slips down underneath your heel inside of your shoe. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3 or 4 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. I also have a second YouTube channel called MrBallen Shorts where I post random short videos. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support, and until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.